Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel for intelligent people wanting to explore subjects of interest of life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I want to discuss, in fact, for the rest of the week, I want to talk about the big story, the intergenerational story facing our world. And to that end, a few things happened this month. A series of speeches successively coordinated by senior US officials, which at any other time would be talked about universally for weeks for their content and what it means for American policy and the US-China relationship. But of course, we're dealing with a massive pandemic, hundreds of millions of people around the world out of work, a US election looming. So this is being pushed to the side, but these speeches are still very significant markers for world history. So we will look back on this period, and people studying this period, these speeches will be prominent. And it's a series of discussions about American policy towards China, specifically the Chinese Communist Party, effectively declaring the new Cold War. And so we are now officially in a new phase of global power politics and history. So the speeches began with National Security Advisor O'Brien, FBI Director Chris Wray, then US Attorney General Bill Barr, whose speech was fantastic, and summed up essentially the other day by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It laid out a significant case. And so what I want to do is, for the remainder of this week, discuss the US-China story. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about the broad brush relationship, how we got to this point. And then the next two episodes, I'm going to review the speeches specifically. So the speeches, there are things that are about them that are amazingly positive and interesting. There are some things that need to be picked apart, a little bit uncertain. And then, of course, I have some criticisms. But broadly speaking, I think this is really excellent for clarifying American strategic direction into the future. And as someone who's been observing this relationship for a very long time, I can tell you that this is an important milestone that effectively sets the starting point for the marathon of generations to come. So today, as I said, I'll talk about the broad brush relationship. Now, I'm going to start way back in the 1940s. So World War II ends. China has come out of a century of humiliation, as they describe it. In fact, I'm going to go back even further. So in the 1800s, there was a series of what's called unequal treaties, where Western powers effectively carved China up in a series of trade relationships. And this all began when there was a huge trade imbalance for tea between the British Empire and China. And Britain, in order to try and square that up, wanted a product that the Chinese would buy, and that was settled on as opium. Now, the Chinese government at the time thought that opium was a very harmful product for its people, wonder why, and banned it. Okay, and so Britain forcibly opened up Chinese ports through the Opium Wars, right? So there's a long history behind that, and that effectively brought China to its knees. Until that time, China believed itself to be the superior middle kingdom on earth that everyone else wanted to be like, and these distant Western powers, the poor things, they would never be able to live up to Chinese cultural ideals of Confucianism. And then that was shattered by British technological superiority. And for the next, right through the Boxer Rebellions, right through Chinese, Japanese imperial expansion, and there's a whole history as to how that happened and why Japan managed to remake itself, but China didn't. And Japan then occupied significant parts of China. And then post-World War II, China finally secured a degree of independence, but it didn't just miraculously emerge as the power it is today. There was another civil war between the nationalists and the communists. The nationalists were ultimately driven off to Taiwan and were only saved in Taiwan by the power of the American Navy, right? But then the Communist Party under Mao Zedong takes over all of communist China, and in 1949 we have the foundation of the People's Republic. So then we have an alliance between the Soviet Union and Communist China. It's Mao Zedong and Stalin. They had a mostly good relationship, you could say. There's quirks about that, but that's for another day. And then when Stalin died and Khrushchev takes over, and he basically de-Stalinized the state and criticized some of Stalin's excesses, Mao Zedong was quite shocked by this. Mao actually liked the way Stalin did things. And that started to create a bit of a rift between Soviet Union and China. And that rift continued to deteriorate right to 1969 when there was a border conflict between China and Russia. The Soviets crushed the Chinese in that struggle, but by that stage, the relationship was absolutely broken. Meanwhile, China had developed a nuclear weapon, right, as it tested in, I think, 1964. And then they'd also fought a war against the United States in Korea, right? So in 1950, when Mao Zedong and Stalin were still very close, and Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, invaded South Korea, Douglas MacArthur, in his bravado and arrogance, convinced Eisenhower to continue to push right up to the Chinese border. And then the Chinese, quite threatened by the fact that Americans were going to be on the Chinese border under a unified South Korea, invaded from the north. And so we had this years-long conflict between China and the United States, but it's never spoken about as a war between the United States and China. It's spoken about as the Korean War. So that's an important part of history as well, that war ended in a stalemate, right? They ended up at the 38th parallel. And so the Chinese certainly achieved its strategic objectives in that conflict, and the Americans did as well, in the sense that they wanted to kick the North Koreans out of South Korea, but were unsuccessful in unifying the Korean Peninsula. So we had this war already between the United States and China, in which both sides sort of achieved what it had set out to do. But you would have to say, probably more so for the Chinese, not because American military power was defeated, but because the Chinese had more at stake. And that's actually a really important thing to remember when we talk about the struggle in the Western Pacific. Who has more invested? So this continued. Relationship between US and between China and the Soviet Union deteriorates. And in the 1970s, Henry Kissinger makes some secret trips to China to try and tease them away from the Soviet Union, followed up by a visit by the Australian Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, and also then President Nixon. And that is the famous foreign policy achievement of the Nixon administration, where they tease China permanently away from its alliance with the Soviet Union into the orbit, sort of the United States. And thereafter, America's position in the Western Pacific is completely uncontested. And when I say that Russia is the linchpin for dealing with China in the future, as I have in previous episodes, the most common question I've been asked since then is, why is this country, which has 1/3 the GDP of Germany, so critical to being able to manage the competition with China? And I will answer that question very directly. It relates basically to geography and the fact that China's grand strategy relies on dominance of Asia. The flip of that was in the 1970s, when the United States had its deal with China, it was uncontested in the Western Pacific. China's relationship with Russia today makes it uncontested in Western Asia, and that is of incredible importance to China's long-term strategic objective. Anyway, so bringing it back to today, we have that relationship has broken down. And the reason for that is once the Soviet Union collapsed, there was an enormous amount of triumphalism in the United States. There was Francis Fukuyama's influential and yet terribly wrong-headed essay called The End of History, where it's basically said that at this point, with the fall of Marxist-Leninism in the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism, the Washington consensus would spread unfettered across the world, that we would have a new era of liberalism where Western democracy, market economics, individual rights, property rights, that would spread unfettered across the world. And that would be a new, renaissance on which the globe would come together in a single ideology led by American hegemony. That was an incredible sense of arrogance and foolishness. There was also a sense that other countries had gone through a transition as well. South Korea went from dictatorship to autocracy to democracy. And that closely correlated its path with market economics, right? That if you traded with China, opened up its markets and economy, that a new middle class would emerge that was quite wealthy. That wealthy middle class would be much more educated, and they would demand greater political freedom to go along with their new economic freedom. And that it was also an economic theory that you needed democracy and independent judiciary and, reliable contracts and trust in the system and transparency in order to grow your economy beyond a certain point. That, yes, you could just mass manufacture for a while, like the Soviets had done during the war and immediately thereafter, this huge industrialization of capital. But at some point, in order to break through that middle income trap, you needed to have a market economy that was supported by democratic, transparent, and independent structures that would allow you to grow. Now, that was a theory that was just proven totally false, right? And we see that in other parts of the world as well. Like Singapore is a incredibly dynamic market economy, but doesn't have the Western democratic tradition that you would expect here in, say, Australia, Britain, or the United States. So that was always wrong, but it was a delightful nepenthe to believe that. So we had all this theory, and most importantly, there was greed. Okay, all of this was self-serving because American companies, Australian companies, British companies, they all stood to get incredibly rich by dealing with China because there's a huge growing market, the greatest market in the world, and therefore, if you could align that with a philosophy that said, hey, we're not just trading, we're also virtuous, then there was a good incentive to promote that idea. And people wedded to that idea for far longer than the evidence could possibly support it, on the belief that ultimately China will emerge as a Western liberal democracy. And this change in American policy, it's probably 10 years late. I remember back when President Xi was first kind of made the leader of China, Henry Kissinger led a kind of a retreat of Republicans out in the middle of the woods somewhere, and I know a bunch of people who went there, where Kissinger sort of said that it's very hard to imagine at this point of China's development, 10 years from now, the same leadership process occurring, that there had to be some kind of liberalization. So prior to that point, every 10 years, the Chinese Communist Party would effectively renew the Politburo, you get a new president, and that was the way to make sure that leadership didn't stagnate, okay? After 5 years, there would be a sort of a designated successor who would then be mentored under the previous leadership, who would then take over, and it was considered sort of a nice bureaucratic turnover to run the governance of the state. Quite the opposite of Kissinger's prediction, and I think Kissinger is one of the greatest minds in foreign policy ever, but contrary to his prediction, President Xi went the other way. Yes, we aren't getting the same same mechanism as was previously the case, but instead of liberalization, it's new imperial kind of emperorship. So we've now got a permanent leader who will remain in power for as long as he chooses to be there, and a China that has become more authoritarian and more autocratic as it gets rich. And the very tools that we have used to try and improve communication and the free exchange of ideas, China is using to control the Chinese people. Most notably, the internet, the tools of surveillance, artificial intelligence, so much more sophisticated for managing and controlling dissent than had ever previously been dreamt up by any totalitarian society before. So in that context, there is now an awareness that that China is not going to become a Western liberal democracy. The Chinese Communist Party is not going to suddenly throw open the doors to independent judiciary and free and fair elections and transparent and accountability government and free exchange of ideas. You won't have channels like this one in China where you can criticize your own country and expect to be able to continue to speak. So that's just not going to happen. And there is an awareness in China, in the United States now that that's the case. President Trump, for all the criticisms people have of him and so on, and the way history will judge him, it's not yet known. But one thing that is absolutely certain is that it is President Trump who reoriented the American state towards China, okay, and its focus on China. So President Obama had his anemic, rather haphazard pivot to Asia that was completely defunct and failed by the time he left office, right? When President Trump came to office, and during the campaign he was very strong on this, American focus was still caught up in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. And if they were talking about some kind of peer competitor out there, it was Russia, Russian influence over American elections, Russian control over American politicians. Completely absurd, totally unsupported by any facts. Meanwhile, the actual geopolitical peer competitor of the United States, China, was continuing to travel under the radar. It was only President Trump that grabbed both parties by the ears and screamed into their face saying, China is the real challenge, and they actually eventually listened. So whatever else might be said for President Trump, his greatest success, in my view, has been to reorient the ship of state away from the iceberg towards dealing with the real challenge. So that's great. And that has been supported by these 4 speeches. The thing that I like perhaps most about these 4 speeches, and where I get absolutely right, is their candor about what happened and how we've arrived at this point. One of my criticisms of the United States generally, right, and I love the United States more than any other country, but one of my criticisms is often a lack of self-awareness, because they have such a loud voice in the world. It's often hard to hear the echo, right, and so often American officials don't understand how they contribute to certain problems, and they need to receive that feedback. Now, what gave me great confidence was this self-awareness about how previous hubris, previous mistakes, obsession with liberal ideology had led to the current status quo, and how we're on the wrong path and where that was going to lead, and therefore we need to reorient. That demonstrates a degree of maturity and sophistication that gives me great confidence in American foreign policy, and is restoring my support for after what I think has been decades of continuous foreign policy errors, is restoring my faith in American grand strategy. So that's great. But I'll make another video on the scale of this challenge, because one of my criticisms of their speech, and it was from one of the speakers, not all of them, was that, oh, yes, we can meet this challenge because we've done it before. Well, no, you haven't. You have never faced a challenge in the history of the Republic that compares with the People's Republic of China, hands down. And I'll make another video explaining exactly how it differs from previous challenges in the past, and why this will be a generations-long struggle and one where you may ultimately lose. Hopefully you won't. There's a way of doing it that will minimize the probability of that happening, but stick with us for future episodes and we'll explain how. If you found this interesting and you found it valuable, please leave a comment, like and subscribe, and we'll continue with this series in the future. Thank you.